All right. Well, for those who don't know me, I'm a historian by training, and so I'm naturally attracted to looking at events in terms of what preceded them, as well as what's likely to come after them. I really like this quote. Was disappointed to learn that it's not really Winston Churchill, but I used it nonetheless. I've also used an historical reference in the title of the talk, and has two separate meanings, really. This is a book written in 1965, as you can see, by Peter Laslett. The real point of this book is not so much the description of how England was before the industrial age, as much as it is a treatise on methodology and teaching us that we learn that in the book that things we believed about England during that period of time, when you actually looked at data, in this case, going around to country churches and pulling marriage, birth, and death certificates, etc., that a lot of things that we believed about that period were not really true. So, for example, on the screen, you see women not generally married off in their teens, households were mostly nuclear, peasants were not always starving. But the other meaning of this really gets back to when I joined early in my career, the research industry. It was a much simpler time. It seemed that almost every problem people put in front of us could be solved with a survey. And of course, the world is much more complicated now than it was then. Which leads me to some propositions about what exactly is happening to us, or what has been happening for, really, in my case, the last 50 years. 4 different forces, I think, at work producing where we are today. The relentless march of technology, look at that in a moment. The loss of public confidence in the work that we do, whether we're talking about market research or opinion research, social research, etc. What I call the unmooring of research from its scientific foundations. And then the gospel of innovation, which we're also familiar with, and this constant search within our industry to find the next big thing. So looking at technology, here's a really crude timeline for what's happened. And, when you take the long view, there's been an enormous amount of change in this industry over the last 50 years. The real question we have to ask ourselves, though, is has all this change led to better data or richer insights, perhaps separating the two? But, it's very hard when you look at the beginning here, where we move from paper and pencil to automating questionnaires, what kinds of benefits we got there. And in my time, I've done some research to show not all that much. The big value is reducing the amount of skip errors we have in questionnaires. And now more recently, we've moved to dealing with existing data, which poses a whole other set of problems for us that I'll reference in a moment. And then moving on to whatever's coming next in terms of, we've already seen the first wave of automation, but what does AI really mean? But taking the long view, the question I'm asking is, are we doing better work today than we were 50 years ago? The second issue is this one of public confidence, which I think is, while the previous proposition might be debated, this one I don't think you can. The graph on the right shows what Pew Research Center here in the US has been experiencing in terms of response rates. And you can see this dramatic drop off, which I think probably surprises no one. So on the one hand, you have this problem of declining cooperation, people simply not wanting to participate in research. But you also have a lack of public confidence in published findings. The most obvious way in which we see this is in the case of public opinion polls, but in general, people do not have a high opinion of the work that we do. And more recently, the GRBN has done some research also, which shows that we have a pretty serious trust problem with people who participate in research. And that is that they sort of put us way down the list. I think something like 40% of respondents in the most recent survey felt that their data was safe with us, which is a real problem if you believe that for our industry to do well, we need to have the public's confidence. The third thing is this unmooring of what we're doing from the scientific foundations that are at the bottom of it. And there are really 2 pillars that research has been based on historically. One is representivity, and the other one is measurement. And if you look at sample to start with, which is the representativity issue, what we've done is we've really defined what sample quality means. It doesn't mean anymore how well does a sample represent the population. We really moved on to issues of hygiene and panels and worried about false respondents, worried about bots, worried about straight lining, things of that area. And this quote here from Andrew Grenville, who's just written a neat little book called The Insights Revolution, sort of gets right to the point, which is that sample is research's Achilles heel, and that it's not improving despite the noise that the panel companies make. It actually is getting a whole lot worse, and unless we quickly course correct, we really could have a problem that is difficult for us to recover from. Now, the same is true of questionnaire design, which has also been redefined. It used to be about measurement. It used to revolve around things like wording, like context, lots of testing to make sure that participants understood what the heart of the question was. But now most of the debate you see is really about the interface, about engagement, and how do we keep people online in order to do a questionnaire. So on the left, you can see what the new paradigm is all about, which is worries about making it mobile first, about the needs to leverage technology to make the experience better, using of color and graphics so that something is more attractive, including game-like features, again, as a way to engage people. And perhaps most troublesome of all is this notion of trying to keep our questions as simple as possible. So on the right here, you have something which I actually saw on the web of someone saying, this is what we need to do in terms of questions. We've got to stop asking these complex questions like the first one, which tries to give people examples of what we're looking for, as well as the time period in which they should reference their answer, as opposed to something very simple that says, which brands have you seen ads for recently? I guarantee you, if you do a split sample test on this, that these two questions will give you fundamentally different results. And so we have to sort of ask ourselves, which of these is really the right direction for us to be going in. And finally, there's the gospel of innovation. You have lots of companies these days who are differentiating themselves on technology rather than on data quality or on the insights that they're coming up with. In many cases, we have solutions looking for problems. The current poster child on that is blockchain. We have also now a class of professional evangelists who preach disruption as an end in itself, and many of whom sponsor conferences now. The whole point being to push innovation rather than to push better insights. And at least if you look at something like Grit, which surveys on a regular basis people who seem to be paying attention to all of these changes in the industry, you see that for a lot of these innovations, they're really not catching on at any significant level, and in fact have been pretty stable over about the last 3-4 years, and even some of them declining in terms of their usefulness. But nonetheless, this whole pressing constantly to innovate just continues. So, where does that put us, right? Where do we end up in all of this as these forces move forward? And are they really something that will sustain us over the long haul? For starters, I think being fast, cheap, and high tech, but wrong, is not the answer. We really need to be a lot more careful in terms of the kinds of methodologies that we adopt, how we evaluate them, and whether we deploy them on a broad scale. And I think that's something that I'd be interested to hear what Ray has to say a little bit later in the session this morning. We also, I think, need to find ways to reconnect the science in some way. I reference here on this slide this notion of design data and organic data. This is a concept taken from a guy named Bob Groves, who's been very heavily involved in survey research issues for many years. Design data being surveys, where we have some control over how we do them, but organic data being more like big data. And how we go about putting science in place for each of these really has to do with, on the one hand, in the case of surveys, to simply design them better. But in the case of data that already exist, being able to use some sort of scientific lens, if you will, to look at data and figure out how good are they? How do we make sense of these data? Are they really saying to us what we think they're saying to us? There's this tendency to think, for example, of big data, that n equals all, that it's perfect, when in fact it's very dirty. And We really need the capacity to be able to look at those data and understand what they're saying to us, how valid are they, where are the biases, and how can we use them in a smart way. Or we need to develop an entirely new paradigm. I don't think that some data is better than no data, which is something one hears from time to time, is a paradigm or a particular ingredient for success. So we need to have some way to think about what we're doing, because with a lot of these methods, as a wise man once say, they work until they don't. And without some sort of scientific basis behind them, it's very hard to see how we don't create some problems for us as things unfold. We also need to do more to rehabilitate our image with the public. For years, associations, for example, have talked about programs which were designed to help people cooperate. This issue of people not trusting us is a major one that we need to be thinking about how we can deal with it. And this general issue of quality of research that appears in public continues to be very problematic. I think this is something I worry about a great deal, that the public image of what we do is going to continue to decline rather than get any better. And finally, we need to take skill development much more seriously. Market researchers are famous for talking about how they all fall in. They don't really have any training or background in what they do, and sort of do a lot of on-the-job learning, a lot of on-the-job training. And I've spent the last 4 years of my life trying to convince people that they would do better work if they took some courses from the organization that I happen to be working for that period of time. It's a very hard sell. And part of it's because those evangelists I talked about are telling people they don't really need to learn those old useless skills, that the world has changed, and so there's a different way to learn to do this kind of work. And while the techniques have changed dramatically, and maybe you don't have to learn those, the principles that underlie that are just as important today, or should be as important today as they have ever been. I was having a conversation with one of our sponsors and describing this issue, and he pointed me to something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a cognitive bias that people have who believe that their cognitive capacities are better than they are in reality. And I think market researchers suffer from that particular problem, and that one of the most important things that we need to be doing is looking not only how do we reestablish this scientific foundation that I've been talking about, whatever its basis is, but also that simply we are more skilled in terms of our capacity to do the work that our clients expect us to do for them. Well, thanks very much.